Welcome back, tank fans. It is the 14th of December 2019. It's the last tank podcast of the year we're going to do. My name is John. I'm joined in the pod by...
Rob, and I'm totally tanked.
Totally tanked! And what tank are we totally tanked about today, Rob?
The KV1 and all its fun derivatives. It's a Russian tank from the beginning of the World War II. Named after Kliment Voroshilov.
Voroshilov?
Yep, that sounds good. The Soviet Defense Commissar. So he was a big man at the beginning of the war, and so they said, right, let's name a tank after him, KV. And away we went.
They did. It's funny because the Russians were quite clever in that they weren't going to go calling a tank after the big boss until they knew it was good.
Yep, until they'd seen some action.
Yeah, because they wouldn't want to associate the boss with a dud. And I can respect that. Mm. One thing I like about this tank is it's a legitimate heavy tank. It's kind of
the Russian Colossus, as the Germans called it, as their poor little 37mm guns popped off the side of it, and they couldn't destroy them until they walked it in front of a 88 or some of their 105 artillery pieces.
Yeah, or also the what I love, which they call heroic action by the infantry, where they would try and sneak up on it with satchel charges or something, which sort of comes very close to just throwing your bodies under the tracks and hoping that they'll get stuck.
Yep, pretty much. But with these tanks, that was a viable option.
Well, they didn't move very fast, so you could catch up with them.
And it was their weight and lack of maneuverability was a big issue for them. So,
yeah, although they did have very wide tracks, which is a lesson the Germans seem to never manage to learn, which meant that it could traverse snow and mud and slush, of which Russia is amply blessed, surprisingly well for such a heavy tank.
Yes, but it also didn't have a snorkel, so it couldn't cross rivers. So you needed it, and it was 45 tons, which is the heaviest tank around at the beginning of the war. And so you needed a good big bridge to be able to cross rivers. And guess what? Russia also has lots of rivers.
Yeah, and not that many good bridges.
No.
Even today, frankly, having travelled a little bit in Russia, and certainly not in the early 1940s.
Which is why most of their tanks are low profile and have good snorkels and wading capabilities.
Yeah,
but not the KV1.
As we've discussed, the Russian snorkeling capability still requires a very happy-go-lucky attitude towards life, because as we discussed in an earlier one of these, rivers aren't known for their good visibility.
No,
it's not like crystal clear alpine lakes or coral reefs. No. So you got to just kind of hope that you're going to get out the other side, and
you're still heading in the same direction.
Yeah, don't stop no matter what.
Don't start doing circle work at the bottom of the river.
Look, getting back to the KV1, I think this is one of those tanks that when a child draws a tank, it looks a lot like a KV1.
Yep.
It lurks in the popular imagination, even if you don't know what a KV1 is.
It's a stripped down tank with one big turret, nice flat sloped armour. And a machine gun out the back.
Yeah, the machine gun out the back looks stupid. The Japanese did machine guns in the back of their turrets
as well. It's to fight off the infantry because they were vulnerable from the rear. Because it didn't have a cupola, so it was just a tank hatch on top. So the commander had to stay inside the turret, so he couldn't be watching out for infantry to the rear. So you had another. I guess assistant gunner manning the machine gun at the rear, watching out the back to see if there's any infantry sneaking up behind to. It was
only a 2-man turret because there was no loader. The commander had to load. Was one of the great failures.
It was a 5-man tank. No,
they had a bow gunner and an assistant driver.
They had two drivers
and a bow gunner, which is the most useless thing to put in a tank possible, but there he was, and
he was the assistant driver,
and no one in the turret to actually put the shells in the gun except the commander, who's also supposed to be looking around, figuring out where he's going, what he's doing, talking to people on the radio. Making the commanders load the gun is one of my favourite pet hates in tank design, along with bow gunners. You're having a machine gun that you can't. Well, you can wiggle a little bit, but you've sort of got to hope the driver passes the bow of the tank across something interesting before you dack away. Shermans had them as well, didn't they?
Yep.
Yeah.
A lot of tanks did.
A lot of tanks did. Modern tanks don't, which suggests that...
They don't want the vulnerabilities of having a nice little porthole in the side of the tank that's only protected by 5mm of rubber or something like that.
Well, the KV1 did have with its bow machine gun, and the format for this podcast has gone completely off the rails, but that's okay.
Really? We don't do things on rails.
Yeah. No, tracks only. They go where they want. The bow machine gun did have an very heavily armoured housing, quite reminiscent of the Australian cruiser, which had an enormous water-cooled front machine gun with an armoured housing, which looked somewhat like gentleman parts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
The Russian one doesn't have the big water cooling sleeve on it, and it doesn't come out as far from the tank, so it looks less like a wang or an owl, as we like to say in Canberra parts. But yes, so it did have everything about the KV. When you see, there's a few videos out there of them moving. Well, there's one at least of one that's museum piece being taken out for a drive, and everything is stripped back. And what I love is that the driver's viewport is this huge square. It's basically a cube on hinges, and this cube pulls up and leaving a tunnel into the inside of the tank, and you see the driver's face framed in this armoured tunnel.
I bet he was happy about that.
Well, at least he did actually. He could both get some decent views. Visibility is quite important to a driver when he wasn't being shot at, and then could quite happily, when he was being shot at, drop a cubic foot of hardened steel between him and danger. And isn't that what we all want when there's danger in the wind?
I'd rather have a nice solid piece of hull that wasn't detachable and would blow into my face as soon as I'm sure it
was angled. I'm sure it was angled so it just wedge in.
Yeah.
You never know with Russian tank designs. No. Crew survivability is... although this is, as a premium heavily armoured tank, was actually designed with the idea that maybe these crew were worthwhile. This is the tank of the 1st Guards Tank Army. And if I ever have to be in any army, I want to be in 1st Guards Tank Army. That's the army you want to be in.
That's the army Billy Bragg wanted to be part of. But what did he end up being? A cook.
Yeah. Billy couldn't help that. He still wrote some good songs.
He did write. He's still writing some good songs. But the point being is that... yes, it was a big, heavy tank for the beginning of the war. It was the biggest, baddest tank around. The Germans invading with their Panzer 3s and 4s were coming up to it and going tink, 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 and couldn't get through the armour. So they'd have to lead the tank into a killing zone with either the 88s aimed down or their artillery pieces, or, as you say, get the infantry in and throw bodies underneath it until their tracks got gummed up and then they ran out of fuel or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's too often when people talk about the Second World War, they say this was the lesson of the war, and they ignore that what was successful tactics in 1939 had been superseded and superseded and superseded again by 1945. So, for example, the massed German panzer divisions of the Battle of France, the Germans had moved very heavily away from just 18 months later, and were using much more combined arms of infantry and tanks working together and smaller tank units. But the thing we all get sort of taught watching the World at War documentaries and things like that is, massed armour was the best way to go.
Breakthrough, encircle.
Well, encirclement's still really important, but that's why your infantry all need to be.
You still and you design and like the KV1 was used later on in the war, was used as a breakthrough tank, but at the beginning it was a defensive tank, which was a really good role for it. It has limited mobility, it was slow, and it had great armour. And so when you're getting invaded, you put 500 of these things in the battlefield and you think to yourself, we're going to do all right here. And they did. And then they didn't. And at the Battle of Rassenai, which is one of the big forces where 500 of these things were deployed, they were all killed. All right. Most of those, however, were non-combat deaths because they got stuck, they ran out of parts, they broke down.
They were tough to recover.
Yep. And all those things mean that you can have a great tank on paper. You can have a great tank who's out the middle of the battlefield blasting things away and impenetrable armor, but it comes at a cost of all the other ones that are sitting in the repair bays not doing anything. And if they're sitting in the repair bay, they're not fighting Germans, and those Germans are encircling you and then taking out the repair areas and killing all the tanks in there.
Look, there was a problem the Russians had, which is that the Germans, one thing the Germans were incredibly good at, and they were bad at a surprising number of things, but encirclement, they were just brilliant at it. And I don't want to generalize about Russians. Maybe it's just because they fight Germans so much, but Russians do seem to have a habit of falling to pieces when they get encircled. They did it at Tannenberg in the First World War, admittedly very different sort of warfare. And in the early days of Barbarossa, on paper, inferior German forces were just encircling them, cutting them all off from supply, and then the Russians would put their hands in the air.
Well, it wasn't encirclement, as they break through whatever defensive line they were facing, and then run amok in the rear areas where there was nobody to fight against them. So, and once you cut off the petrol and ammunition of your frontline organisations, then they can't do anything, and suddenly they're saying, "Oh, we just give up."
Yeah, but it's still. I mean, the Russian-German war is underappreciated in the Western world, and was, a huge continuous conflict with a lot of different phases and a lot of different areas. And the one thing that the Russians are underappreciated for is some of their large-scale planning. The Germans, their staff work really broke down once it got above army group level. Whereas the Russians were in these, not just army groups, but these things they called fronts, which was combinations of
that was
groups.
Later on in the war, after the people who'd been purged right at the beginning, which is one of the things we need to talk about, had then gained enough experience to be able to say, all right, you know what, throwing these tanks into the teeth of the German guns doesn't work. Let's think of something different. So they did go through a learning curve, and there was a lot of people killed by that learning curve. But the purges, Stalin didn't like having people who were associated with Germans and other organisations and his general staff at the beginning of the war. He didn't want to keep them. He said, right, you know what, these guys might have preconceived ideas that they could do a better job than me. So, you know what, I'm going to get rid of them, bring in lots of people who don't know what who haven't got the experience of the last 20 years of being a tank general, put them in charge and say, now, win this war for me. And that's pretty much where the KV1 was stuck, in that a lot of purges had happened, and suddenly, by the time Barbarossa happened and Rassenai, your upper commanders were green. They didn't have the experience because everybody else had been, the people who did have the experience had been purged. So that's another issue with the KV1, is that it was hamstrung by that, as well as the repair and logistics issues.
Now, one thing I briefly wanted to cover, last episode we did a French tank, and we totally forgot to make a joke about reverse gears.
They are very fast in reverse.
But they do only have one reverse gear on the AMX-13. So,
not five.
Apologies to everyone. We've made our...
Because most tanks have...
one or two, yeah.
No, or five.
It depends on the tank.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But because of the high revving engine, you can actually go really fast backwards.
Okay, good to know. But yes, the jokes about French military cowardice are generally ill-founded. Okay, getting back to the KV1. Speaking of the purges, one of the problems of the purges was they literally selected for competence. If a general was good, they were more likely to be purged. And that doesn't mean you're taking huge losses in your general class, which is bad enough. But when the losses you're taking are specifically the clever, competent, popular generals, you really leave yourself with a substandard army. It's worth noting, because it's like, oh, isn't Stalin silly? He did these purges. If you put yourself in the Russian shoes...
Yeah, you've got to have a certain mindset saying, I'm going to a situation that's going to be stressful for everybody, and I've got to make sure I'm still the man at the top come next year and the year after. How do I do that? By getting rid of anybody who, for the next 2 years, can influence my ability to still be at the top.
Yeah, but I would say that it's Stalin gets painted as paranoid, particularly in Western propaganda. And I'm not questioning that Stalin was paranoid, but it comes back to that old question of if they really are out to get you, are you actually paranoid?
Yeah, and
And
let's face it, if there had been somebody competent after the first 6 months of the war, when the Germans are all on the way to Moscow, that somebody might have said, you know what, you're not good enough.
Comrade Stalin's time is over.
Yeah. All right. So he made a choice and murdered millions of people to do it.
But I would go back a few steps. Go back to 1919. The Russian Civil War, again, a massively understudied and underappreciated conflict in the West.
How many KV1s were there?
No KV1s in the Russian Civil War, but a lot of the guys who became officers in there were commanding KV1s by World War II, which is why I bring it up. Huge civil war fought against enormous Western forces. There were
Australians.
A number of Australians won Victoria Crosses fighting in the Russian Civil War against the communists. Large American forces, large British forces. There was a Czechoslovak legion that fought its way, could never manage to go west back towards Czechoslovakia, so fought its way across the whole of Siberia with armoured trains, and eventually ended up in Shanghai, and then managed to get shipped back home to Czechoslovakia in time for the Germans to invade.
I thought they got imprisoned before the Germans invaded. I thought they were seen as suspect to Czechoslovakia and got or maybe I'm thinking somebody else.
No, that was after World War II. The Czechs who fought in the West all got imprisoned.
Anyway, look, let's get back to
yes. Okay, my point is Russians fought major conflicts that we don't really appreciate. They fought a very big war against the Japanese in 1938 as well. Which also led to the development of the heavy tank doctrine, because the Russians said bigger and heavier is better, and isn't it nice that the Japanese are unable to penetrate our tanks, and we want more of that.
We could go into the Japanese war, but I don't think we should, because I think we've gone off on enough tangents.
Yeah. Point was, getting back to the KV1, the Russians were experimenting with really big tanks. They had lots of turrets. One of them is the T-35, not to be confused with the T-34, had 5 turrets.
And 11 crew?
Something like that, yeah. And they then made the very sensible decision, this is a bad idea, it's adding a huge amount of cost and complexity, but hey, we've got this chassis that can carry an enormous amount of weight, let's just have one turret on it with a pretty good gun, and that leaves so much spare weight in the design that we can just put really thick armour everywhere.
90 mils of armour on the front, 70 on the sides, and away you go. There was bouncing shots until the Germans came out with the long-barreled 75s and 88s. Yeah,
or, the way the Germans destroyed most of them that they got early on was firing artillery in direct fire mode, which is not an artilleryman's...
preferred option.
No.
No. All right, so types of KV1s. Okay, and how many there were? All right. 5,200 made overall. The main one was the KV1 itself, where there's over 2,700 made of those between 40 and 43. The big brother, big turret, as it was called, of KV2, which 334 of those built.
Now, KV2 has spawned 1,000 tank memes, because its enormous turret because it was designed for a very indirect fire mode, which needed a huge breach traverse. So it's a huge blocky turret, and then people have done memes stacking 2 or 3 of these things on top, and it looks very funny, and everyone says, isn't that a silly tank? And it was indeed a silly tank.
152mm gun, though. So it was the biggest barrel gun around on a tank. So,
but you can't ever get it anywhere useful.
The reason why they had it was because the Finns had a lot of bunkers, and so during the Winter War against Finland...
And the Continuation War.
And, they said... Oh, we can't blow up these Finnish bunkers, concrete bunkers, with our 76mm guns, so let's double it and come out with a 152. And you know what? They could blow up bunkers with those because there was a huge bloody round. However, the tanks themselves didn't really survive terribly. They got taken out pretty quick.
But there was a very successful self-propelled gun made using the KV chassis. And while the KV1 was not in use by the Battle of Berlin, the SPGs based on the KV chassis were heavily engaged in the end of the war. So
all 300 plus KV2s were dead by the end of 41. Then there was the KV1S. They'd reduced the weight and the armour, put a bigger 76mm gun on it, made it a little bit faster. Again, they were starting to realise, you know what, we're building these things, but we're not getting a huge amount of benefit compared to the T-34. So it's the same gun as the T-34, slightly slower, a bit more armour, but by this stage the Germans had bigger guns, and so their armour wasn't making any difference to the German tanks that they ran into, whereas at the beginning of the war it really made a big difference.
Yeah, and an underappreciated thing is the Russian 600 horsepower diesel engine, which they got relatively early. They had it by, I think, 1938. And basically every Russian armoured vehicle, even getting up to very close to the modern day, they just said, this engine's great, does everything we want of it. And then that dominates their tank design. If they want a faster tank, they put less armour on. If they want a bigger gun, then they do that. But this 600 horsepower diesel just sits there
standardised,
the same. Yeah.
Build it in any tank factory around Russia and the Urals. So they made 1,000 plus of the KV1Ss, and then they moved up to the KV85. So that's where they put an 85mm gun on in front of it. And they were in use from 43, and they only made 150 of those, but they did use them for their breakthrough activity. So where they'd gone from a defensive war with the KV1s, and it was very effective at that because they had the heavy armour, suddenly they needed a ability to... They're on the offense from 43 onwards, around then.
Mm-hmm.
And that's...
Post-Kursk. Yeah.
Yep, and that's where they needed a tank to be able to break through the lines of the German forces and then send the T-34s through afterwards to then exploit, just like the Germans had done to them. And the KV-85 was the breakthrough tank. So it would smash the line with its bigger gun, heavy armour, and mass numbers. Of 150. Actually, it's not in mass numbers. It'd just be...
150 is a lot of heavy tanks.
Yeah.
But it's worth noting that while the Russians were very big on this concept they called deep battle, and Russian fans of Russian military history will today still bang on about how important deep battle is, which is where they plan to engage the enemy at every way, 20 miles in front of the front line, through airstrikes and fast units and infiltrators and all sorts of things. They never got encirclement down the way the Germans did. Even up to the very bitter end, the Germans were still breaking out of encirclements that the Russians would never have thought of trying to get out of. But the KV and its successor, the Yusuf Stalin, or the IS to its friends, was absolutely essential, as you say, to this spearhead of penetrating German lines.
So let's talk about from 43 onwards, old mate Clement Voroshilov, the Soviet defense commissar, was...
Can you just try that one more time?
The Clement Voroshilov.
Just roll the R's.
Yeah, no good at
Natalia.
Yeah. He was a bit out of favour, and so this is why they've taken the same design of the tank, but they've renamed it the Joseph Stalin, which is the IS in Russian, and away they've gone. And it became their late war tank for taking on all those activities. One of the things we were talking about before with the T-34, the T-34 was cheaper, faster to build, and had a better supply and logistics system. So suddenly that's one of the big reasons why they
when we say better supply and logistics, though, what you really mean is that just because it's so much more common, there's more parts for it,
and it's less complex,
and more training. The training pipeline is a really neglected part of,
and it's less complex as well. So it didn't the gear system, the gearbox system of the KV1 was atrocious.
Although in both tanks, I've heard stories of the drivers having to use sledgehammers to change the gears. So that might be a common factor of the Russian. When we say agricultural nature of the machinery, these things were literally converted tractor gearboxes.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But again, with the T-34, you also, by the time the Germans' tanks had bigger guns, you didn't need the armour anymore, so you wanted more mobility to be able to avoid the shots rather than sit there and take the shots. So again, the T-34 was suddenly outstripping the capabilities and the desire for the KVs.
Sitting there and taking the shots is, in my view, a poor strategy.
Well, it's fine if the other guy can't get through your armour.
Yeah, but it's you can say it's fine, but okay, yeah,
it sucks up a lot of resources.
There's no such thing as perfect armour either, and even a 40mm anti-tank round on the track that pierces the track is going to give you an effective mobility kill. Because unless you can have your guys move the line forward from where you are, you're still dead, essentially dead. Or just waiting for that artillery to move up and direct fire on you. You want to do beer review?
I think we should do the beer review, John.
Beer review. What have you brought us this week, Rob?
We have got Bombardier Premium British Ale. Now, this thing has got so many Union Jacks on it.
Nice Union Jack on the lid.
Yep.
I like that. And of course, Britain is celebrating the vanquishment of the Euro weenies and a glorious new dawn of independence. I don't actually believe any of that, but that's
the big money is going to be happy.
That's the big money is happy, and the big money likes beers like this. So it's brown, it's sweet, it's malty.
It certainly is.
It says that a fruity aroma and rich malty taste provide a crisp, mouth-watering beer.
Now, we did debate whether or not to have this warm or cold, but it's a bit hot here in Canberra, so we said, bugger that, we're having it.
It's Australian summer. Look, if the Brits had our summers, they wouldn't drink cellar temperature beer either.
But I can see a warm one of these during the middle of winter would probably be fine, but it is going down quite nicely for a Saturday afternoon.
Yeah.
I did look for, because we're having the Bombardier, I did look for some good British self-propelled guns to talk about today, but my extensive search of World of Tanks turned up nothing, so I said, bugger it, this will do.
Now let's talk briefly about the World of Tanks impact of the KV1.
Oh.
Now, normally when I'm doing these, you can get some good videos of people driving a particular tank around and even some experts talking about them, and it's, and anything the Chieftain does. I highly recommend him if you're on YouTube as opposed to the podcast audio medium, which thankfully he's not in. The KV, every video is spotty teenagers playing World of Tanks showing off how they killed everything in their KV1.
Yep, pretty much. It's a good standard tank for mid-battle, tier 5.
Mm-hmm.
I got one specifically because I kept getting killed by them, and that's my usual reason for getting into a tanker, saying that guy's killing me all the time, therefore that's what I should be driving. But yeah, it's for a tank you can get through the system. It's a good solid tank at tier 5. As soon as you go up above that, you start getting killed by everything, because everybody knows all their guns can go through your armor. But at the right tier, it bounces a lot of shots, just like it did in the war. So not a bad thing. Now let's talk about other cultural impacts besides World of Tanks.
It inspired the Tiger.
Ooh, the Germans realised they needed a heavy tank in order to do something with it. I think the Tiger was already on its way by this point, but they did need a...
The development of the Tiger might well have been on its way, but the manufacturing in volume, I believe, had a lot to do with German reactions to fighting Tigers in the initial... not Tigers, fighting KV1s. And that the need to have a heavy tank. And, I mean, the Germans had done very well up until that point with your Panzer IIIs, which were barely tanks at all in a lot of ways, although beautiful ergonomics and design. And your Panzer IVs, which in the earlier war, yes, they did upgun them in the late runs, but the early war had a quite low velocity
and that was the thing, is as soon as you put on the longer barreled, high velocity guns on the German tanks, they were going through the KV1s. And so you couldn't rely on your armour there, whereas at the beginning of the war, they only had these 37mm guns, or even the short barrel 50mm guns, and they were just bouncing. Other fun cultural things.
Okay.
The Finns during the Winter War captured 2. Now, we talked about this before, so they've captured 2 KV1s during this war. They've kept them, and they've then deployed them later on in the war. They didn't have a huge impact.
It's very unsporting, Finns.
Yep. They didn't have a lot of impact, but in tabletop wargaming, because the Finns have got captured KV1s on their order of battle, these highly skilled, high morale infantry troops who didn't usually have armoured support suddenly have the option of buying KV1s to go with these high morale, highly skilled troops. And so what should have been you should be fighting a infantry army with the Finns. Suddenly people are deploying 10 KV1s with their Finnish armies because, well, it's on the order of battle, but you only ever captured 2. No, it's on the order of battle. Therefore, I can deploy these tanks in this highly skilled, highly trained army, and away they
It
go.
only costs 150 points. It says so right there, yeah.
It's one of those fun little things. The Germans also had some captured KV1s because, again, in the early war, they couldn't get through them. So, let's just pick one of these up and turn it around, paint a swastika on it, and
they used a particular shade of grey to try and distinguish them as captured ones, and it was mostly from my looking through them SS divisions, which might have had quite unusual procurement chains, used a lot of the captured KVs.
They probably just didn't. They probably knew they weren't going to get in trouble for taking risk and doing things that they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, well, that's the history of the SS.
better to ask forgiveness than permission. Well, how did that work out for you, boys?
Doing things they shouldn't have been doing. Yes.
Now, the other fun one was having started to look up information about the KV1 at home on my computer. Saying, oh, look at all this information. The next day, I'm logging into Amazon to watch something. Guess what comes up? It's a movie about KV-1s called Tankers from Russia. I'm thinking, hang on a second here. I think somebody's been spying on what I'm doing. Now, I don't know if it's true. I'm not going to say, but I feel there's a bit of a cause there that old mate Amazon's saying, oh, he's interested in KV-1s. Here's a movie about them. Maybe we'll watch it.
Isn't the future wonderful?
Yeah.
This is great.
Yeah.
You're getting things relevant to your interests.
I did watch the movie. It had a sideline love interest type thing, but it was fun to watch for watching the KV-1s break down and all the issues they had to go with them.
Now, I've got a little admission to make in this. In the interval sound, I generally use audio of the tank we're talking about. I don't know if I've ever actually made that clear to the audience, but I assume they've realised that that's what I've been doing.
I didn't realise.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go. For this one, I have got audio of the KV1 in modern operation. But I could not get anything of KV1 gunfire. But there was a T-34-85, and it's exactly the same cannon.
It is?
So that's what I've used. And it's quite a distinct, very high-pitched as cannons go. I wouldn't want to hear that being fired at me at all. I've actually got a T-shirt with a T-34-85 on it. And it was funny, my girlfriend bought it for me for my birthday and said, it's your favourite thing in the world, tanks. I'm like, oh, but I like warships more. She's like, warships? But this is a tank podcast, so so that 85 gun was essentially, up until the Cold War got going, as big a tank gun as you needed. I guess, the Tigers with their 88s really smashed through anything, but if you got a good shot off, there was no tank on the battlefield that could withstand it.
Yeah, I mean, even your King Tigers, they're, 107
or something like that?
No, 150 mil armour. They even, because it was all flat armour, it would just take that shot and go, and eventually smash straight through it. But it's the sloped armour that the Russians were using would bounce a lot more because of their, they would use sloped armour and so forth. Yeah,
I mean, the sloped armour does bring the issue that you've got less volume you can protect much less volume with the same weight of armour. It's not as simple as just saying sloped armour is good and unsloped armour is bad. And then there's also the thing with the Tiger that if you angle the tank, you've got sloped armour. Although you are exposing your sides. So swings and roundabouts there.
Yeah, we haven't got into any of the beaky Russian tanks yet where they said, why, if I'm fighting somebody head on, do I need to angle my armor? Or I could just put a beak on the front of it and have it angled anyway by facing straight towards them where I've got the thickest armor, and it's sloped in every direction where you don't want to be angling.
Yeah, I mean, Matilda did something kind of similar with its cast bows, but in a 90-degree turn. But yes. Anything else you want to talk about with the KV1?
They even had a flamethrower version.
They did. Yes, Russians love their flamethrower tanks. They've still got some really big ones today.
Really?
Yeah, it's called the TOS-1, and it fires thermobaric missiles.
So not actually a flamethrower, but...
No,
Because I was about to say, if you're in a tank battle and you're fighting at 30 meters range,
you've got some problems, yeah. Although there was the classic thing, like Germans, cowards that they are, didn't like it when flamethrower tanks came up to their bunkers and would run away. And it's like, you know what? I don't think that's a German thing. I think anyone who has been unable to stop the flamethrower tank's arrival and is looking down the barrel of the flamethrower that's about to squirt through the loopholes of my pillbox, I'm leaving too. There's just nothing to be gained by staying there to get barbecued at that moment, is there?
No, really not. All right, so KV1 overall 5200 made, very good tank for the Russians at the beginning of the war, heavily
Still
armored.
Questionable whether they would have been better off putting the resources into building more of other tanks.
Yep, that is a very good question, but they didn't stick with the design that they had. They always were looking to improve it. So continuous improvement is a catchword these days, and they were doing it. So every year they were coming out with a new design, and they would roll out another 1,000 of the new design.
It is also quite possible on some internet tank fora to see a lot of argument about this is this model and that is that model, as if there was a centrally designed, closely adhered to system.
Yeah.
When the reality was that different factories with different available parts.
The quality control was not up to notch.
Well, quality control is a whole other issue because, the whole tanks, it's like cars built on a Monday, tanks built on a Monday, could have quite significant defects as well. But just that, what parts were available? Do you stop your tank production line because you're out of a particular type of gun or a particular type of fender? Or do you say, we'll bodge in this other part that we do have available? I think when Joseph Stalin's
I was about to say,
enforcers
our quota for the month is 500 or 200 tanks. Therefore, we're going to produce 200 tanks, whether or not they work or go, shoot, and have armor. Don't care. We can get a tick in the box, KPI met of 200 tanks.
Yes, exactly. So there is actually a huge amount of variation, and this definitely causes a lot of problem for Western rivet counters who want to be able to look at a silhouette in a piece of film and say, aha, that is such and such model. They can be wrong, and they can argue quite a lot about it. But in general, if it's an enormous Russian heavy tank, it's probably either a KV or an IS, and they're really the same thing.
Well, the IS had they'd done a lot of work with the turrets to be able to make them not capture shots and to be able to bounce.
Yeah, taking out the shot traps. Having said that, there are some ISs that were had the old KV turrets put on them. Again, on the basis of what was available. So on that note, we'd like to thank you for...
thank you very much for listening.
And we will be back soon with another tank.
Another tank.
So, like, share, subscribe. Tell your friends who like tanks. And do feel free to get in touch via... Probably Facebook's the best way. We read that.
Yeah. And try out the Bombardier British Premium Ale. I found it quite nice. John?
Yeah, well, it's a really malty beer, so not like your lagers or things, and actually reminds me quite a lot of the Russian beers I've drunk in Russia. So there you go. There we go. Quite by accident, but it's reminiscing on the Trans-Siberian as I sip on it. So that's good. All right, folks. Thank you very much, and we'll be back in your ears in the new year.
Goodbye.